The crystal whiskey glass shattered against the wall just inches from my head, sending shards cascading across the worn hardwood floor. I didn't flinch. After years of my father's explosive outbursts, I'd become numb to the violence that punctuated his disappointments. "You ungrateful little bitch," my father bellowed, his face contorting with rage, veins pulsing at his temples. "After everything I've done for you." I stood perfectly still, a strange calm washing over me as I watched him. This man who had once been my hero transform into someone I barely recognized. The irony of his words wasn't lost on me. Everything he'd done for me? For the past 4 years, I'd been the one paying his mortgage while he gambled away whatever money crossed his path. "I'm done," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "This ends now. My name is Susan Walker. I'm 53 years old, recently promoted to marketing director at a firm I've dedicated 20 years of my life to, and today is the day I finally stopped being my father's keeper." 6 hours earlier, Dad, I can't give you $15,000, I said, setting my coffee mug down on the small table in his senior living apartment. "That's almost my entire retirement cushion." Richard Walker, my 78-year-old father, once the charismatic owner of a successful construction company, now looked at me with the practiced charm that had bailed him out of trouble his entire life. His blue eyes, the same shade as mine, twinkled as he leaned forward. "Susie Q, it's not like I'm asking for a handout," he said, using my childhood nickname that now felt like emotional manipulation. "The executive suite has a view of the lake. After working my fingers to the bone all my life, don't I deserve some comfort in my golden years?" I felt the familiar guilt rising in my chest. He'd been using this tactic since I was a child, masterfully deploying fragments of truth to obscure the larger lies. Yes, he had worked hard once, building his construction business from nothing after returning from Vietnam. I remembered watching him pore over blueprints at our kitchen table, his calloused hands carefully marking measurements. But that was before the gambling started, before he'd risked everything on poker games and horse races. "You already have a perfectly good apartment here," I replied, gesturing to the comfortable, if modest, surroundings of his current senior living unit. "An apartment that I pay $4,200 a month for, on top of my own expenses." "Your father deserves the best," Susan, Linda, my stepmother, interjected as she entered from the kitchenette, bearing a plate of store-bought cookies. At 66, she was 13 years my senior, but had been married to my father for nearly 15 years. She'd been a receptionist at a medical office when they met, just 11 months after my mother's death. Family takes care of family. Family. The word hung in the air, weighted with expectation. I thought of my mother, who had died of cancer 15 years ago. I remembered her final weeks, how she'd pulled me close and whispered, "Take care of yourself first, Susan. Your father will drain you dry if you let him." At the time, I dismissed her warning as the bitterness of a failing marriage. Now, with 2 decades of enabling behind me, I understood exactly what she meant. "I already am taking care of family, Linda," I replied, keeping my voice measured. "I've been covering Dad's expenses since he lost his retirement fund at the casino 5 years ago. I've postponed my own retirement planning. I've sacrificed my financial security. And I'm not giving you $15,000 to upgrade to a luxury suite when I'm barely funding my own IRA." My father's charming demeanor slipped. "You have no idea what it's like to be old and dependent," he snapped. "When I was your age, I'd already built a company and put you through college." "A company you gambled away," I said quietly. Flashback, 20 years ago. I still remember the day my father called me, his voice uncharacteristically small, to tell me he'd lost the company. I was 33, newly divorced from a brief, childless marriage, and focused on climbing the corporate ladder. The banks were closing, he admitted. Some investments didn't pan out. Later, I would discover these investments were actually high-stakes poker games. My father, who had always loved the thrill of risk, had graduated from the occasional friendly game to underground tables where tens of thousands changed hands in a night. The economic downturn had already weakened his business, but his gambling had delivered the killing blow. I had flown home immediately, stepping into the chaos he'd created. The house where I grew up was filled with past due notices. My mother had been gone just 5 years at that point, and it was clear he had been spiraling ever since. I'll help you sort this out, I promised him, already calculating which of my savings I could tap into. But you need to stop gambling, Dad. Get help. He agreed tearfully, seeming genuinely remorseful. And for almost a year, he did stop. He attended Gamblers Anonymous, found a job with a former competitor, and began rebuilding. I paid off some of his most pressing debts and returned to my life, believing the crisis had passed. Then came Linda. They met at a charity event, married quickly, and soon my father was investing again. The cycle repeated: crisis, promises, temporary improvement, then collapse. But each time, the financial request grew larger and my retirement account grew smaller. Back to the present. I've sacrificed enough, I said firmly, standing up. I won't keep enabling this, Dad. Your social security and pension are enough to cover this apartment. If you want the executive suite, you'll have to find another way to pay for it. Something dark crossed my father's face, an expression I recognized from childhood, the precursor to his rage. Linda saw it too and moved slightly away from him, a well-practiced choreography. You think you're better than me? He growled, his charm completely evaporated. Always judging, just like your mother. The mention of my mother stung, as it always did. He knew exactly where to aim the knife. I'm not giving you the money, I repeated, reaching for my purse. And I think it's time we discussed a change in our arrangement. I can't keep funding this. That's when he grabbed the whiskey glass, a crystal tumbler that had been my grandfather's, and hurled it against the wall. You ungrateful little bitch, he shouted, rising from his chair with surprising agility for a man his age. After everything I've done for you. Linda retreated to the doorway, her face set in a familiar disapproving frown. Susan, why can't you just help him out? She asked, her tone suggesting I was being unreasonable over a trivial matter. The calm that settled over me in that moment was almost surreal. I'd spent decades in this cycle, but something had finally broken. Perhaps it was the shock of seeing my grandfather's heirloom shattered on the floor, or perhaps it was simply that after years of bending, I had finally reached my breaking point. I'm done, I said, my voice steady. This ends now. At Nancy's office. So you just walked out? Nancy asked, leaning forward in her ergonomic office chair. My best friend since college days, Nancy now ran her own psychology practice, specializing in family trauma. Her office walls were lined with degrees and self-help books, many focused on setting boundaries, something I clearly needed help with. I did, I replied, still somewhat surprised at myself. I just left. Nancy nodded approvingly. After 20 years of financial abuse, it's about time, Susan. What's your plan now? I pulled a folder from my bag, one I'd been compiling for months, though I hadn't admitted to myself why. It contained bank statements, transfer receipts, text messages, emails, a meticulous record of my father's financial dependence and manipulation. I've been paying for that senior living apartment in my name, I explained. Legally, I can change the financial arrangement. I'm going to have my lawyer draft paperwork that limits my contribution to what he can't cover with his Social Security and pension. Nancy flipped through the documentation, her professional demeanor briefly giving way to shock. Susan, this says you've given him over $175,000 in the past 5 years alone? I nodded, feeling a fresh wave of disbelief at the figure myself. I kept thinking he'd change. That if I just helped him through this one crisis, he'd finally take responsibility. Classic enabler thinking, Nancy said gently. We've talked about this in theory for years, but seeing it quantified like this. She closed the folder. You know this won't be easy, right? There will be guilt trips, manipulation, family members taking sides. I thought about my cousins, my aunts, how they might react when my father inevitably painted himself as the abandoned elderly parent. I know, I sighed. But I'm 53, Nancy. If I don't stop this now, I'll never be able to retire. I'll spend my golden years working at Walmart while he lives in luxury. And that's reason enough, she affirmed. But beyond the financial aspect, this is about your emotional well-being too. You've been carrying his burdens for decades. It's time to put them down. The legal process. The following week was a blur of activity. I met with an elder law attorney who helped me draft the necessary paperwork to modify the financial arrangements at my father's senior living facility. No longer would I be paying the entire bill. Instead, my contribution would be the difference between his income and the cost of his current apartment, not the executive suite he coveted. Will he be evicted if he doesn't make up the difference? I asked the attorney, a kind-faced woman in her 60s who specialized in these difficult family situations. No, she assured me. The facility has options for residents whose finances change, including payment plans and even financial aid for long-term residents. Your father won't be homeless, Susan. The relief that washed over me was immediate. Despite everything, I didn't want him suffering. I just couldn't sacrifice my future anymore. When the paperwork was delivered to my father's apartment, the backlash was swift and vicious. My phone exploded with texts and calls, first from him, then from Linda, and finally from extended family members who'd heard his version of events. How could you do this to your own father? He gave you everything, and this is how you repay him? What kind of daughter abandons her elderly parent? Each message was like a knife, expertly aimed at my deepest insecurities. I found myself second-guessing my decision, the lifetime of conditioning threatening to override my resolve. Block them, Nancy advised when I showed her the messages. At least temporarily. Give yourself space to breathe. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the block button. It felt so final, so irrevocable. But then I remembered the shattered glass, the years of manipulation, the draining of my retirement savings. I pressed block. That night, I spread all my documentation across Nancy's dining table, double-checking that everything was in order. The financial records were airtight, and the evidence of my father's gambling problem painted a clear picture of why this step was necessary. You've covered all your bases, Nancy said, scanning the papers. If they try to fight this, they don't stand a chance. Thanks, I replied, managing a small smile. I just wish it didn't have to come to this. You gave them every chance to change, she reminded me. This isn't on you, Susan. It's on them. Her words gave me some comfort, but the weight of the situation still pressed down on me. Even though I knew I was doing the right thing, part of me couldn't shake the sadness of it all. This wasn't just about money. It was about years of hurt and disappointment finally coming to a head. The unexpected call. The next morning, I received an unexpected call from the lawyer handling the financial arrangements. Susan, I wanted to let you know that your father reached out to us. He's trying to contest the changes, claiming that he's entitled to the full payment. I clenched my jaw. Did he provide any proof of an agreement? No, the lawyer said, and he doesn't have a leg to stand on. The payments were voluntary on your part, but I wanted to give you a heads up. This could get messy before it's resolved. Thanks for letting me know, I said. As I hung up, a new wave of determination surged through me. If my father wanted a fight, he'd get one. But this time I wasn't backing down. Over the next week, I focused on organizing my evidence more thoroughly. Bank statements, text messages, proof of my payments. It was all there, a clear trail that outlined exactly how much I'd done for him. Nancy helped me sort through it all. Susan, she said, holding up a particularly damning set of texts where my father had promised to stop gambling if I paid his bills. This alone shows how manipulative he's been. You've got nothing to worry about. I know, I said, exhaling slowly, but it's still exhausting. I can't believe it's come to this. Fighting my own father just to protect myself. You're not fighting him, she said firmly. You're standing up for yourself. There's a difference. Later that evening, I received an email from the lawyer with copies of my father's challenge to the proceedings attached, a rambling letter filled with half-truths and outright lies. He claimed I'd only paid his living expenses as a favor, and that he'd always intended to pay me back, though he conveniently provided no evidence of such an arrangement. It was frustrating to read, but also oddly freeing. His letter was desperate, full of holes, and completely unsupported. For the first time, I realized how little power his words held over me when I didn't let them. I replied to the lawyer, attaching additional documentation that refuted every claim in the letter. By the time I hit send, I felt lighter, like I was finally taking control of a situation that had controlled me for far too long. The confrontation, 2 weeks after the paperwork was delivered, I returned to the senior living facility. Part of me hoped to avoid a confrontation, but I knew that was unlikely. My father was waiting in the living room, sitting in his favorite recliner with a TV remote in one hand and a fresh whiskey in the other. Linda hovered nearby, wringing her hands. "So you're really going through with this?" he demanded as soon as I entered. "Yes," I said simply. "The new arrangement is fair, Dad. You'll still have this apartment, but I won't be funding upgrades or extras anymore." "Fair?" He spat the word. "You think it's fair to change the rules on an old man? After I sacrificed everything to give you a good life?" "You did give me a good childhood," I acknowledged, separating the father he had been from the man before me now. "And I've shown my gratitude by supporting you financially for 20 years. But I need to think about my own future now." "Your future?" Linda interjected. "What about our future? Richard isn't well, you know that." She lowered her voice dramatically. "His heart condition." I almost laughed. The heart condition was a convenient fiction they deployed for years when other tactics failed. My father's last physical had given him a clean bill of health. "His medical care is covered by Medicare," I reminded her. "And his living expenses will still be covered between his income and my contribution." My father stood up, his face flushing with anger. "You think you're better than me, don't you?" he spat. "You're just like your mother, always looking for a way to make me the bad guy." I held his gaze, my hands trembling slightly, but my voice unwavering. "This isn't about being better or worse, Dad. It's about boundaries. I've let you take advantage of me for years, but I'm done. If you want more than I'm giving, you'll have to find it elsewhere." He didn't respond, just sat back down with a grunt. "You'll regret this," he muttered. "No," I said, turning toward the door. "I won't." As I walked out of the apartment, a strange sense of peace settled over me. I wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in years, it felt like mine. The aftermath. The days that followed were quieter than I expected. I thought my father or Linda would launch into another round of frantic calls or try to intimidate me into reversing my decision. Instead, there was silence. Part of me wondered if they were in denial, thinking I'd change my mind or that the legal process would somehow fall apart. But I knew better. I'd done my homework, covered every detail, and ensured that the law was firmly on my side. One morning, I received an email from the lawyer handling the case. "Your father has not filed any formal objections to the new arrangement," she wrote. "The facility has accepted the terms, and his current accommodations will continue with the adjusted payment structure." The news brought a mix of relief and sadness. Relief because it confirmed that I was finally free of this toxic cycle, and sadness because, deep down, I still wished things had turned out differently. Nancy invited me out for lunch to celebrate the progress. "Here's to Susan finally setting boundaries and reclaiming her life," she said, raising her glass. I laughed, clinking my glass against hers. "It's about time, isn't it? You're handling this so much better than I would," she admitted. "If it were me, I'd probably be plastering 'financially independent at last' billboards all over town just to make a point." "That's tempting," I admitted, smiling. "But I think the paperwork does the talking for me." As we ate, Nancy leaned forward, her expression turning serious. "How are you, though?" "Really?" I paused, considering her question. "I feel lighter," I said finally. "It's like I've been carrying this weight for so long, and now I'm starting to let it go. But it's also bittersweet. They're my family, you know. I wish they'd made different choices." "That's on them," Nancy said firmly. "You've done more than enough. It's okay to let go." As the weeks passed, I drove by the senior living facility occasionally, wondering how my father and Linda were adjusting. I didn't stop, didn't reach out. I needed this distance to heal, to rediscover who I was outside of my role as my father's keeper. New beginnings. 3 months after the confrontation, I sat on my apartment balcony with my morning coffee, looking out at the city's skyline. For the first time in years, I felt truly present, not constantly worrying about my father's next crisis. I had begun to reconnect with parts of my life I'd put on hold. I signed up for a photography class, something I'd always wanted to do but never had the time or energy for. I started spending my weekends exploring new hiking trails, breathing in the fresh air, and letting myself feel truly alive. The changes weren't just internal. I'd met with a financial advisor who helped me create a plan to rebuild my retirement savings. It would take time, but for once, the future looked promising rather than bleak. Occasionally, Linda would send a text, usually a thinly veiled attempt to extract more money. "Richard misses you," she'd write. "He's been talking about that Alaskan cruise you always promised to take him on." I never remembered making such a promise, but it was typical of their revisionist history. I'd respond politely but briefly, never engaging with the implicit request. To my surprise, my father had reluctantly begun attending the Senior Living Facility's Gambling Addiction Support Group. I harbored no illusions about miraculous transformation, but when the facility director mentioned it during a routine billing call, I felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps setting boundaries had been good for him too. Our relationship remained strained, but not severed. I began visiting once a month, brief, civil encounters that were carefully bounded. No money was discussed, no past grievances rehashed. It wasn't warm, but it was sustainable. Epilogue. 6 months later. "You'll never guess what I did yesterday," I told Nancy as we sat in our favorite cafe, brochures for an Alaskan cruise spread between us. "What's that?" she asked, sipping her latte. "I booked the cruise," I said, unable to keep the excitement from my voice. "First class cabin, just like I always dreamed." Nancy beamed. "Susan Walker taking a vacation? The world must be ending." I laughed, realizing how foreign the concept of self-indulgence still felt to me. "It's still 6 months away, but having it on the calendar. It makes everything real, you know?" "I do know," she said, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. "You deserve this. You've earned it." As we chatted about excursion options and packing lists, I found myself reflecting on the journey of the past year. The shattered whiskey glass, the painful confrontations, the legal battles, they had been necessary steps on a path to freedom. I hadn't wanted any of it, but I needed all of it. "You look different," Nancy observed, studying my face. "Lighter." I considered this. "I feel lighter," I agreed. For so long, I thought taking care of him meant sacrificing everything. I confused enabling with love. And now I understand that real love includes boundaries, I said. "I can care about him without being responsible for him." Nancy raised her mug in a toast. "To boundaries," she said. "And to your Alaskan adventure." I clinked my cup against hers, feeling the unfamiliar but welcome sensation of looking forward rather than back. At 53, I was finally learning that it's never too late to reclaim your life, to set boundaries, to put down burdens that were never yours to carry. My father would always be my father, with all the complexity that entailed. But I was no longer his keeper, his bank, his emotional punching bag. I was simply his daughter, an independent woman with her own life, her own dreams, and now, finally, her own future. As we left the cafe, I paused to take a photo of the autumn leaves swirling across the sidewalk. The image captured more than just the seasonal beauty. It captured a moment of transition, of letting go, of moving forward. This was my life now, and for the first time in decades, it truly felt like mine.